Hey, welcome back to Business 163 Personal Finance. And we are now in module number 10, looking at the very important topic of housing. We all have to live somewhere, and wherever we live will have financial implications. And so, of course, here we are, module number 10. One of the largest considerations that we'll really make that will affect our personal finances: where will we live? So, as you can tell from the title slide, this very first introductory video kicks off the topic trying to answer the question, do we want to rent or do we want to buy? Renting or buying? This really is perhaps the first way to divide into two categories or one decision. Which way you're going to go? Renting or buying? And so you can see here, as we've noted here, renting or buying, well, your home, no matter what you end up doing, for most of us, our home expense is the biggest single expense in our monthly or annual financial categories, right? That's the big one. Whether we're paying rent or mortgage, typically that will be the largest single expense in all of our budget. But we need to acknowledge that although this is a personal finance literacy course, our home, where we live, represents far more than simply a financial expense. For each of us, our home is one of the most central parts of our lives. It's simply the way that we're made and wired as human beings. That are wrapped up in our home are all sorts of very emotional and psychological components of who we are, including our self-identity, our sense of security and safety, our emotional well-being, and quite frankly, for those of us who are maybe a little further along, our home may represent a lot of things like where we bring up our children, where we raise families. And so it is not simply a financial expense or something we show off to the neighbors. It really is far deeper rooted in our identity, in our emotional and psychological well-being. We need to acknowledge that because we don't want to take this question, renting or buying, you don't want to take that lightly. It involves a great part of our lives. Now, that being said, let's just give you some pros and cons, right? So first of all, when we consider renting, right, well, realize that renting is, for very, very many of us, the first start of our journey of independence from our parents. And so for many of us, not all of us, but many of us, the first time we move out of our folks' house is to go to college, if we go away for college, and sometimes that's in a college dorm or something similar to that. And then from there, we move out to renting an apartment with roommates. That's the way it works for so many of us. Quite frankly, this is how it worked for me. When I graduated from high school, I went off to college, and first year I lived in the dorms, and then my second year I moved out to rent an apartment with a couple of friends that I'd made while living in the dorms that first year. And that's the way it goes for, many college students. And depending on whether that's right after high school or when you finally go off and leave College of Marin to go to transfer to a four-year university or whatever it is, for many of us, whether college is involved or not, the first moving out and going out on our own, sometimes what we casually or colloquially refer to as launching, right? Many times that's moving out to rent an apartment. And so back to the slide now. You see here, what are the advantages of renting? The advantages of renting on the left there, well, compared to buying, it's a relatively small cash outlay to rent something, an apartment, right? Typically compared to a mortgage loan, for instance, to buy a home, when you rent, the monthly expense is somewhat lower than a mortgage payment. Not always, but most of the time, if you're renting an apartment, it's probably going to be less than a mortgage payment. In addition, if something in your apartment breaks, the toilet stops working, the kitchen sink is leaking, the electricity goes out in the living room, hey, you don't have to fix it. You don't have to pay to fix it. You simply call your landlord or the property management company, and they have to get it fixed. They're legally obligated to make sure that it's fixed. And the last pro on this list, by the way, this list is not intended to be comprehensive, just some representative ones, right? So one of the last advantages we've listed on the table is renting offers you greater mobility, right? You're not owning a home, and therefore, whenever your lease is up, or if you're renting month to month, at the end of the month, if you want to move, you just give notice, you can move somewhere else, right? Move to another part of town, move to a different city, move to a different state, right? All those things are possibilities depending on the other factors in your life. Much easier to do and much faster when you are renting. Now, what are some of the disadvantages of renting? You can see them right here on the slide, on the right-hand side of the table. All that rent you pay every month, you don't realize any tax benefits at the end of the tax year. You also will have no control. Let me go back to that first point. Tax benefits. What kind of tax benefits? Well, if you've never had a mortgage loan, then you may not realize the interest that you pay. You get a statement at the end of every year how much total interest you paid on that loan for that calendar year. That amount can be used as a deduction on your federal income taxes. That can be a huge offset to income. And I realize we haven't quite yet hit the module on taxes yet, and so this will make a little more sense when we do, if you're not familiar with that. But having tax deductions is a powerful way to reduce your annual tax obligation. Mortgage interest gives that to you, and you don't get it if you're renting. All right, let's keep going in this table. You have no control over rent increases. Now, of course, you may live in a city that has citywide rent control. Here in the Bay Area, the city of Berkeley has rent control. The city of San Francisco has rent control. But most places around the Bay Area don't have rent control, which means if the landlord decides to jack your rent up, you don't have any control over that, right? All you can do is, well, move someplace else, right? But you can't, you don't have any real power over what happens with the level of rent. In addition, you realize by renting, you are signing a legal contract, and therefore you are accountable to the landlord and the terms of the legal contract, right? It is no small thing to break the terms of a rent agreement. You could find yourself in court, all right? And finally, all the rent that you pay every month, you don't get any long-term accumulating value out of that. Unlike owning a home, you don't own the apartment, and so any increase in property value you don't get to enjoy, right? Because you are simply paying for the privilege of using the space. You're not buying the space. Now, that's just the big ones, the big pros and cons of renting. Let's move on to buying and consider that. Well, as you can see here, my very first bullet point, right? Well, buying a home in many ways is part of the American dream that we have been taught and that we're familiar with, maybe from our very early days. What does it mean to be successful here in this country? And part of that quote-unquote American dream is owning your own home. And so what are the advantages of owning your home? Well, from a financial perspective, you see the first one on the list. The interest and property taxes you pay on that home are tax deductible. And so again, once we hit the module on taxes, you'll understand the very large impact this can have on your taxes. In addition, every time you make a mortgage payment, you pay off a little bit of that mortgage loan, which means you own a little bit more of that home. That's incredibly important because building equity in your home is typically, historically, the number one way that working class folks have built generational wealth. The reason we've had wealth to hand on to the next generation, our children, is because we built up equity in our home over time. And we've talked about this, of course, in the module on racism in finance and banking, right? That one of the great tragedies of keeping, systemically, keeping home ownership out of the reach of certain folks in our great nation has been a crime of cutting off access to building generational wealth. It's basically condemning a group of people to a history of poverty. And we mentioned that in that module as well. You see it here, right? Okay, now, number 3, what's another advantage of home ownership? Home values well, even apart from the equity you're building with every single mortgage payment you make, home values will typically appreciate over time. And so many times, well, especially here in the Bay Area, right? A home that you might have bought for $200,000, $250,000 a decade ago is now maybe worth well over $1 million. The value has appreciated over time simply because of the strength of the real estate market. You enjoy that. That is in addition to the equity that you now own. And all you had to do was basically just, well, stay in the house, right? Live in the house, right? Spend your years in the house and the value is appreciating while you sleep. All right, what else? Some other advantages to owning a home? Well, you can decorate it however you choose, right? You can do whatever crazy thing you want to do in your home, and there's no landlord to tell you, hey, the lease agreement says you can't do that. No, you own it. You can do whatever you want, right? And finally, and this last bullet point is not to be taken lightly. By owning a home, you instill in you and your significant other or family or children a sense of community, a sense of stability and security and rootedness. You are planting roots, and that is difficult to measure, but not to be discounted in terms of psychological and emotional health. Now, what are the disadvantages to considering buying a home? You see them there in the table. It's a very, very high entry cost, right? To come up with the down payment and closing costs in order to buy a home, we are talking about tens of thousands of dollars. And in certain neighborhoods, especially here in the Bay Area, you may be talking about close to or over $100,000 in order to purchase a home. No small amount of money. It's very high entry cost. And for many folks who want to buy a home, that may be the single one prohibitive factor, the very high cost and how difficult it is to save up a down payment. All right. In addition, once you finally do own the home, many times mortgage payments will be higher than if you were simply renting. And so you have to have the commensurate level of income to be able to afford the mortgage payments. In addition, you are responsible for maintenance. Remember we talked about that toilet stopped working, or the lights went off in the bedroom, or you've got a plumbing leak? Well, who do you have to call? Well, just look in the mirror, because that's who you're calling, right? You're going to be figuring it out. Either you got to pay for it, or you got to go to Home Depot and figure out how to fix it yourself. But you are ultimately responsible for the maintenance of your home. That can get pretty expensive, all right? You are also financially responsible to pay the property taxes, right? Yet another cost of owning a home. And so it basically requires that you have the wherewithal and income to afford that kind of a thing. And so many times it takes folks and families many years to be able to afford their first home. Now, we will say either way, whether you choose to rent or to buy, there's an enormous lot of things to consider, right? You see the family who's just gotten the keys to their new home on the left, as well as the two gals as roommates moving into their apartment that they just rented. Whichever way you end up going, right? There is an awful lot to consider, and we'll talk about that in the upcoming video lectures. I realize that as you are in this course, you may have already made a decision about whether for now you're continuing to live with your parents or you are living in a dorm situation, or renting an apartment, or renting a home, or maybe for many of you, you do own your home right now and you understand already the financial implications of those kinds of things, right? So anyway, this is just our introduction to module number 10. I hope this sort of gets your curiosity and your interest going to learn some of the details and some of the many things you'll need to consider as we really seek to address how is it that our home and our housing decisions are such a significant part of our financial commitments. Alrighty, thanks so much. We'll see you in the next video.